Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to you all and welcome to the final day of the conference. Our third session is on strategic communication, misinformation, and hate speech. To be moderated by Naomi Miyashita. She was previously responsible for policy analysis on emerging strategic and operational challenges facing peacekeeping, including the development of 2021 Digital Transformation Strategy for Peacekeeping and the FOP Declaration of Shared Commitments. Last year, Naomi conducted research on disinformation targeting UN peacekeeping missions in the Center for an Informed Public of the University of Washington. She has served with the UN system in Rwanda, her first UN job, DRC, Chad, Sri Lanka, and Haiti, where she variously worked on demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration, political analysis, and UN coordination. At the UN headquarters, she has held various positions with the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, Office of Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict, and the Office of the Chef de Cabinet. Please join me in welcoming Naomi to the podium.
Thanks very much, General. It's a real pleasure to be back in Rwanda again after about 15 years of not having been here, and really impressive to see also how the country has developed, and really the Kigali has transformed itself since I was last here, so congratulations to you for that. So today we're going to talk about stratcoms and mis and disinformation, and I wanted to make a few points before we get started, drawing a little bit on the points that came out from yesterday's conversations, of which there were many very good points, and I wanted to touch on four in particular that try to set strategic communications and mis and disinformation a little bit in the bigger picture, and not just as discrete and technical tasks. The first point I wanted to make is that strategic communications is not a panacea for peacekeeping shortcomings. And I think we can't use strategic communications to paper over some of the strategic and operational weaknesses that we have experienced in the field. I think that's a point also that came out from yesterday's discussions. So whether these shortcomings are related to mandates that aren't clear or achievable or matched by the requisite resources, or whether they're related to how a mission executes its POC mandate, I think one has to look at those issues in and of themselves and not hope that strategic communications can necessarily sort of cover up or paper over those aspects. The second point is that strategic communications in peacekeeping is not a panacea for mis and disinformation either. I think mostly because, particularly when we look at disinformation or hate speech, they are deliberate attempts to harm, and they have a strategic intent, and they're seeking an effect. And I think we see that in various missions that we have ongoing in Africa. So communications alone is not going to address those particular issues. The third point I wanted to make, and in a way it's a sort of counterpoint to those 2 points, is that strategic communications can illuminate the good that peacekeepers do, and I think the Force Commander of UNMISS highlighted this yesterday. And I think, having served in peacekeeping missions myself, I can say that the work that peacekeepers do really touches the lives of people. It's very direct, it's very visceral in some ways, it's very immediate and tangible as well. And there are thousands of untold positive stories that peacekeepers do that happen every day that can be projected and disseminated and amplified. And Stratcoms, working with other components like civil affairs and the force and police components, can offer also the opportunity of engaging in a two-way dialogue with communities to better understand and manage expectations. It's really a tool for us to be more accountable to the people that we serve. And I think also through Stratcom's components, together again with civil affairs and also others in the country team, there's a way in which we can also work to strengthen the resilience of the societies where we're operating against the challenge of mis and disinformation. My fourth point is related to mis and disinformation and hate speech specifically. I think in today's world, disinformation and malinformation have proven to be a really powerful tool that's been used in a way to erode consent and to undermine peacekeeping credibility. We talk a lot about them sort of as one and often sort of like lump them all together. But these are multidimensional challenges that actually require differentiated responses. So you're not necessarily going to respond to misinformation in the same way you would respond to hate speech or even to disinformation, for which you may use, for example, a reporting mechanism if one sees inauthentic online behavior with regard to disinformation, or hate speech which has legal connotations and for which you may also want to engage in sort of trust-building activities as well. So they're differentiated responses to these different phenomena. There's one thing though, even though we tend to lump these all together and there are differences, there's one aspect which I think they have in common, and that is around understanding the digital information environment. And for all of these, one has to have a very good understanding, and for that we need to have the monitoring and analysis capabilities, which I think are in the pledge guide as well, to develop a good understanding of what's happening online and of course offline as well, ideally merging the two. So this is why my team, which I lead in New York, focusing on MDH, is developing a policy framework and training, including pre-deployment training, and providing direct support to missions to help them better tackle this challenge and also adopt a whole of mission response to it as well. And I have to also take a moment to thank all of the member states that have supported us so far and continue to support us in this area of work. So with all that said, I will now proceed to invite the panelists to the podium. And first up is Francesca Mold. Fran Mold is the Strategic Communications Chief of the Department of Peace Operations, leading a team responsible for global media relations, crisis communication, digital campaigns, and outreach. She also served for 5 years as the Chief of Communications for the UN mission in South Sudan, leading 110 national and international staff in 10 field locations. Prior to peacekeeping, Francesca spent a large part of her career working in politics in diverse roles, including Chief of Staff of the Communication Director for the Leader of the Opposition in New Zealand, and as a television and newspaper correspondent. Francesca has a Bachelor's of Arts degree in English Literature, postgraduate journalism qualifications, and a Master of Philosophy with distinction, with her thesis focusing on the digital communication strategies of the Islamic State and Hamas. Very topical issue for nowadays. So welcome, Fran. Thank you. Next, we have Ambassador Madeleine Garlick, UK Ambassador and Deputy Permanent Representative to the African Union. Ambassador Garlick oversees the cross-government UK office to the AU, representing His Majesty's government across a range of priorities. This includes working with the AU member states and the AU Commission on conflicts affecting Africa, efforts to support economic empowerment, food and health security, and championing the rights and contribution of women and girls. Madeleine has worked for 10 years on conflict, peace, and development issues at the UK Foreign Ministry. In 2020, she was the Chargée d'Affaires in the British Embassy in Bamako, Mali, and has worked at the UK mission to the United Nations in New York with a focus on Africa, conflict, the United Nations, and peacekeeping. Prior to this, Madeleine worked on a range of multilateral issues with a focus on the environment and climate change. Welcome, Madeleine. Next, we have Yolande Makolo, government spokesperson of Rwanda. Yolande has been the spokesperson of the government of Rwanda since July 2021. Previously, she served as communications advisor and speechwriter for the President of Rwanda. Before that, she was communications director in the Office of the President. For 3 years, starting in 2003, she served as communication director and then coordinator of the PACFA, now Imbuto Foundation, of the First Lady of Rwanda. Yolande started her career working for non-profit organizations in Montreal and Toronto, Canada, before moving back to Rwanda in 2003. Welcome, Yolande. And finally, we have Alan Chaboy, who I hope is in the room now. Alan is Code for Africa's Senior Investigations Manager, leading its iLab forensic investigation team that focuses on identifying the bad actors and mapping the networks they use to seek and amplify toxic content, as well as analyzing the behavior and techniques they use to circumvent existing safeguards in an attempt to propagate disinformation, hate speech, influence campaigns, and organized crime in Africa, leveraging on digital peace building, open source intelligence, and media monitoring tools and techniques. Welcome, Alan. First, try to draw out some of the challenges and the issues facing peacekeeping missions in the two areas that we're discussing, and then we'll go into further detail. So my first question is for you, Fran. Can you tell us a little bit about the challenges that are confronting missions as far as strategic communications are concerned?
Thanks, Naomi. I think we talked a lot about the challenges yesterday, but I wanted to list them very briefly because they are greater than ever. And while they're political and security challenges, they're also communication challenges. Firstly, rising global tensions, stagnating political and peace processes on the ground, more complex conflict, an increase in armed groups with criminal links and more often transnational in nature, the climate crisis is fueling conflict over scarce resources, reduced support from host governments, sophisticated and aggressive mis- and disinformation campaigns, complex and ambitious mandates which are sometimes beyond our capacity to deliver. Expectations are high, and so is public frustration as suffering continues in many peacekeeping contexts, which makes us a target. Taking all that into account, it's not surprising that we are seeing growing questions about the value and impact of peacekeeping. Confronting these challenges, we're taking a two-pronged communication approach. Our first priority is to proactively communicate on the roles, responsibilities, and capacities of missions. We're trying to strengthen understanding of what we do and to manage expectations. As Naomi mentioned earlier, we're also trying to demonstrate the tangible impact of our work across all platforms through strong and compelling narratives. Essentially, we're trying to tell the story of peacekeeping in a simple, human-focused, and disciplined way to connect with the audience on an emotional rather than a transactional level. Our communication has to be inclusive and interactive. We need to listen to the needs of those we serve and reflect their voices in explaining the challenges, as well as testifying to the difference that peacekeeping makes to people's lives. We have to be creative, particularly in the face of changing social media algorithms that are driving divisive and negative content. Our digital content has to appeal to audiences and be tailored to the platforms that they are using. We know that if we fail to communicate, we leave a vacuum of information and it will be filled by others with negative or malicious intent. The second related issue is crisis communication, which is absorbing more and more of our time. I think when I arrived at UNHQ nearly 2 years ago, it was about 30% of my time. Now it's probably 60%. On that issue, I wanted to touch on some comments made yesterday, and Naomi referenced this as well, that we shouldn't have too high expectations about what Stratcoms can achieve, and that communication can't change people's minds. I do agree that we need to be realistic. Our communication has to be authentic. We have to faithfully report the challenges that we face. We shouldn't sugarcoat or try to hide failures because doing so damages our credibility. Instead, we should be transparent and accountable as possible and promote an understanding that we are not a perfect tool. We do our best within certain limits. But if we do spend more time on promoting the results and the benefits of what we do, in my experience, you can influence perceptions over time, and you can prevent or at least navigate crisis situations. It's about building up credibility and trust and communicating consistently in good times and bad. And I want to thank the Force Commander from UNMISS for referencing that yesterday, because it's certainly an experience that I had in South Sudan where we were able to change perceptions over time by working across the mission. So thank you for that.
Thanks a lot, Fran, for painting that broad picture. Madeleine, you've worked on peacekeeping for many years in different capacities. How do you see the gaps in capabilities and in tools as far as Miss and Dis and Stratcom's concerned?
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Two things before we start. First of all, to thank the government of Rwanda personally for hosting us today, and second, to recognise our largely female panel, with all respect to Ellen as well. So thank you for allowing us this space. So I think there's probably 2 points I'd make to start, and the first is that we all need to be incredibly honest that we're working in a really sophisticated social media landscape, and governments and international organisations are losing this battle. We are not, many of us, including myself, are not trained practitioners, and we are in a new world. The belligerents and sometimes the host governments are way more tooled up than we are for this engagement. We see smartphones and social media being used in populations, even in far-flung rural areas. The challenge we face is that the belligerents can do short, sharp comms in local languages, and they do not need to embed those messages in any sense of truth. And the social media network that we face means that truth is a secondary consideration. However, as governments and international organizations and militaries, we are determined to put forward a truthful picture, and sometimes that makes us slow, and it makes us complex, because truths are complex. And belligerents can use short, sharp, false messages and have an impact. So just one example from my time in Mali, working with MINUSMA. In my time there were regular attacks by jihadist groups in the north and the center. And within half an hour, the groups would start to claim various attacks on civilians. Sometimes multiple groups would claim the same attack within 45 minutes. We had no way of assessing whether it was true. We had no way of communicating with the communities quickly to assess whether this was happening. We didn't even have the ability to confirm the attack had taken place, that the video was not old, that they were not using out-of-date photos. And in that environment, we are facing a huge challenge as governments. We need to modernize and we need to systematize how we do communications, which is probably my second point, which is that it's been clear from today and yesterday's conversations that strategic communications is not an add-on or an extra. It is underpinning missions mandates and underpinning missions consent at the moment. So all of our focus should be on upskilling missions at every level to do strategic communications. I think that's my sort of fundamental message. This isn't something one or two people can do. It's not something that can be left to headquarters or a faceless social media Twitter account. It has to be something that everyone in the mission is thinking about all the time. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Madeleine. And that's a good segue to you, Yolande, as spokeswoman for the Rwandan government. How do you see, and also now that we're confronted with the digital communications that Madeleine has just outlined for us, how do you see strategic communications, and do you see a redefinition of Stratcoms necessary to better, in peacekeeping settings, to better respond to these challenges, digital challenges, and also how to better align Stratcoms with mandate implementation as well?
Thank you very much. I think I'm coming at this from a maybe slightly different angle, given the work that I do. So I see things a little bit from a different perspective. First of all, when it comes to protection of civilians in particular, it's important that the UN agencies use the insights and information that are generated within the system, including being aware of the contradictions that come up to contribute to the success of the mandate. In other words, the protection of civilians should not be politicized. We see this happening, and it contributes to ongoing confusion and undermines mandates in some cases. I'll give an example. In the case of ongoing hate speech and violence ongoing in Eastern DRC currently, we had the UN Special Advisor on Prevention of Genocide, Alison Deritu, issue 2 statements quite recently on the situation. These statements detailed and warned against the proliferation of hate speech and attacks on targeted communities in Eastern DRC, mostly of Rwandan expression, Congolese Tutsi communities. Yet we saw that this did not precipitate action in the broader UN system. In fact, it appears that the statements were also somewhat ignored by mainstream media. This has consequences on lives on the ground and directly impacts on the mission. And it shows the importance of having this whole system approach to protecting civilians. And I think in particular, there has to be zero tolerance in situations where host nations are proliferating this hate speech and the rhetoric that causes violence and persecution of targeted communities. Otherwise, we're all bystanders and enablers, and this emboldens institutions like this to even increase harmful actions because there are no consequences. So, I mean, in conclusion, what is said about these situations, including the current ones that we're seeing in the region? I mean, what is not said is almost as important as what is said. So we have to examine and address these gaps in information because they have a direct consequence on lives. In addition, I think we have to understand that in situations, particularly in less developed countries, social media, the digital world is not everything. It's quite dominant, especially in elite situations, people like us who have phones and laptops and we're constantly watching TV and so forth. But it's not the same on the ground. There's not proliferation of the gadgets or internet in some of these communities where peacekeepers are operating, but there is the spread of misinformation. So we have to find ways to identify the source of these problems and then address them in a way that makes sense and not assume that what we're seeing from where we are is also what's happening on the ground, even though social media accelerates some of this misinformation. In many communities, especially in Africa, for instance, radio is king, still, in 2023. So this has to be invested in, it has to be used properly to reach people. I think for a start, I think that's what we should be looking at.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Yolande. And thanks also for reminding us that, in fact, in peacekeeping settings, internet penetration rates are quite low and that radio and word of mouth continues to be the main way of spreading misdis and hate speech and communication between communities. I wanted to turn to you, Alan, now. You work for Code for Africa, and you are steeped in all things misdis and hate speech as well. I wanted to ask you, what do you see as some of the gaps, technological gaps and legal gaps that might exist in the work, in your line of work?
Thank you so much. Yeah, so there are quite a number of challenges and gaps that have been impacting a lot of the work that we do, but also many other organizations do in terms of strategic communication, but also early warning, detection, and response for cases of misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. And one of the main challenges, of course, is data access, especially because, a lot of these vices, online harms, and digital conflicts happen on social media platforms. And these social media platforms are privately owned, majority of them, and that means, all the data that they collect, all the data that they host is privately held. And it has been quite a challenge in terms of getting, independent researchers to actually evaluate some of the hypotheses that we are working with. For example, cases of hate speech during elections, or targeted, coordinated trolling of different organizations, including peacekeeping missions. So I think that is one of the key challenges that I would say has been very prevalent. The other one is, a lot of this analysis requires specialized skill sets. And historically we've seen that many organizations, and especially in strategic communications, will have skill sets that probably at the moment would not be so relevant in terms of the analysis. In my experience, there has been a lot of data analysis that is involved in terms of identifying cases of hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation as compared to general monitoring. So, and this means that, the skills required to do this is quite expensive, and in Africa especially, there is quite, a challenge in terms of getting such levels of skills. Privacy concerns contribute to a lot of the other challenges. In a lot of the work that we do, we've seen that cases of hate speech and mis and disinformation have started shifting to closed platforms like WhatsApp and Telegram, which are some of the biggest platforms in Africa. And one of the things that I think is particularly important is that because of the limitations and about visibility of content in these particular platforms, especially by independent researchers and organizations, it becomes very hard to know, the extent of hate speech and divisive content that is being spread through these platforms. And I think at the end of the day, AI is becoming, a key driver for mis and disinformation. We've seen videos emerging in different countries in Africa that are AI generated, targeted at different, organizations, and even, the UN Peacekeeping Mission recently. And it's important for us to also identify that, we need to figure out early warning detection techniques, technological techniques, in order for us to be able to identify these cases early on and respond as quick as possible. From a legal perspective, and just to look at some of the gaps legally, I think the lack of harmonized legal frameworks across the globe is one of the major challenges. Because if you look at a problem like hate speech, there isn't a universal definition of hate speech, and this is because from different contexts, from different countries, hate speech is defined differently, dependent on different cultures, cultural experiences, protected characteristics of groups, and I think that is one of the key limitations in terms of tackling mis and disinformation. And then one of the other things is that a lot of these bad actors that operate on social media, on digital platforms to actually share mis and disinformation are kind of operating at a cross-border level. So individualized country-level action and legal structures don't necessarily help in countering, these things, because you will only be able to, take action in one particular jurisdiction, a country, for example, but then a lot of the attacks are coming from elsewhere, right? And then finally, I think the other thing is, of course, data protection. Laws and regulations are very limited. A lot of these digital platforms collect a lot of data on our citizens, and especially, they are being used to target advertising, but at the same time, it becomes a risk, for the citizens themselves in terms of exposure to the data that they hold. So I would say that also is one of the key things legal frameworks should put into consideration across Africa, but also across the world in order to address these issues. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alan. Really specific and a really great set of points. So I'd like to turn now to you, Fran. So we've heard from the different panelists about some of the challenges, not what is not being said as being as important as what is said, as Yolanda mentioned. Some of the examples from Madeline on how armed groups communicate, and Alan's just painted a really comprehensive picture of some of the tech and legal challenges. How do you see the role role of Stratcoms, and particularly how do you see the building of capabilities and capacities on the Stratcom side?
I kind of agree more with Alan's point about the limitations, particularly among peacekeeping personnel, of the skills that are needed. In the digital sphere, we are decades behind in terms of the skills that are needed. Just last week, I tried to advertise for a strategic communications officer, and I was told I can't even use that title because it doesn't exist in the UN. I have to use public information officer, which again is decades out of touch, and it's frustrating from that perspective. Just taking it back to the limitations on the Stratcoms front in other areas, for me, firstly, it's about trust. The communications teams and the missions have to be trusted. Too often we're still, I think, an afterthought. We are in an information war, to put it bluntly. And on the communications front, we are a shield in times of trouble, but we're also fighting for our missions. And if we're not involved in risk management, crisis management, and decision making, then we can't help missions to navigate the risks that they are facing. I think the second issue for us is mission leaders. They are the principal voice of the mission, they are our advocate, and we need them to understand and embrace strategic communications as a core part of their job. Our communication strategies also aren't robust enough. They're not really grounded in understanding of perceptions of missions. We don't know what people think of us, therefore we can't shape our communication approaches. We also need to make sure those strategies are aligned with the political and security objectives of the mission, and that's not always the case at the moment. Back to the issue of resources, I would like to also comment on the importance of uniformed communications officers. Again, we have to call them public information officers, but they're much more than that. They are on the front line of engagement with communities. They are embedded with communities in remote and diverse places that civilian comms staff can't get to. They are often the first to detect emerging narratives, changing public sentiment, and we need them to feed that information back in a kind of whole-of-mission approach and understanding of the communication challenges that we're facing. And we also need them to shape our communications approach. We need them to be collecting content for our digital platforms and helping guide our messaging so that we actually reach the audiences that we need to. Lastly, for me, this is a bugbear, is bureaucratic hurdles. Still at the UN, too many layers to get through before you can even issue the most simple statement. And I'm going to give you an example recently on a case of sexual exploitation and abuse. I had a very simple factual statement. It had to be approved by 17 people before we released it. And by that time, the story was already in the media and we lost the opportunity to lead the narrative, which was in fact not a bad story. It was the fact that the mission had taken very robust action to deal with this as soon as it was discovered. I can't even begin to speak about that issue. Thanks.
I feel your pain, Fran. We work in a very bureaucratic organization. Madeleine, you talked earlier a little bit about the kind of short, sharp messaging of the armed groups in Mali. What, in your view, are some of the ways in which we can have more compelling content that speaks to the people that we engage with?
Thanks, Naomi. So this is the bit where I think we try and tackle that information war, right, as a group of individuals who want to improve this environment. And I have great sympathy for the issues around clearance of messages. And that, I guess, would be one of my first points. Actually, let me start with some underpinning ideas, right, which I think is quite important for us. We're sort of policy people, right? The first is you need to really focus on who your targets are. And I think too often we don't nuance that. So ultimately, these are the people that provide your license to operate, your consent. These are your targets. We're trying to use comms to secure consent, who are our targets. And that ranges from, quite frankly, the host government sometimes. I've been astounded at the level of misunderstanding about what mandates are from government ministers in a number of peacekeeping settings. So, they are a target, your host government ministers, leaders, etc. So target them, but you're also targeting sometimes local receivers of peacekeeping services, right? The communities that we're there to serve. Another area we haven't, I think, done well enough is thinking about the neighbors. We talked about misinformation, disinformation being cross-boundary. You're not just communicating to the country you find yourself in, you're communicating to their neighbors who sometimes are engaged with the conflict in a positive or a negative way. And you're also communicating, frankly, to policymakers like me, the Security Council members. Again, huge amounts of misunderstanding about what the mission is actually doing on the ground. So I think you need to sort of segue and think about the different audiences, and a well-designed communications approach, you can do one thing that hits all of those targets. And I'll give you a very practical example, which is a bit UK-centric, but close to my heart, which is our deployment of a long-range reconnaissance group into the UN mission in Mali, MINUSMA. It started in January 2021 and lasted about 2 and a bit years. And as part of that, we did an extensive proactive engagement campaign. And it plays to the point you made, Fran. We use military, named, faced individuals to communicate with what our battalion was doing on the ground. At least one tweet a day, if not more. So a steady drumbeat, regular communications. And our commanding officer at the time was given the leeway from headquarters to do that. So that was really important. He did not have to clear every single tweet every day with HQ. He could be responsive and react to what he was seeing. Another thing, very basic, if you do like 101 training on social media, pictures, engaging content, photos speak 1,000 words. We all know what that's like. You're scrolling through your phone. You don't spend a lot of time. Put pictures in. And also, really important for us, but it was complicated in Gao, think about whether you need to message with the host government and the host community or separate from them. So depending what you're doing, it can make sense to sometimes joint message and sometimes not. So if we were doing a long-range patrol and we were taking the local forces with us, absolutely making sure that we joint message that patrol. It built confidence with the communities and their local security forces. It showed join-up activity, and it showed that we were working with the host. Again, building that culture of consent and the perceptions and realities of consent. But you know, sometimes, for example, we were engaged in an armed situation and our guys had to fire back. That wasn't an appropriate space to do joint messaging. We had to speak very ruthlessly about the fact that we were defending the mandate and defending our troops and defending the community who we were working with. Other small things, we've talked about them yesterday. We had women on patrol and we made sure we gave space to women doing messaging to other women. We had local translators and support individuals who, again, were messengers. And I think we used that really well. One final thing I'll pick up on, again, which I think we forget. Every single member of mission staff, uniformed or civilian, is a communicator. They're a social media user. So we are not doing enough to understand the habits of our own ecosystem in the mission, you know, thousands of people sometimes. What are their messaging they're putting out there? Is it coherent with the strategy that we've agreed is the important messaging of the mission? And are we using that local expertise? So, you know, local staff, certainly in our embassies and high commissions, are huge assets. They understand the local comms media. They have strong relationships. Are we using them as amplifiers? So that it's not just the UN mission or the government making the messaging. It's our huge network of amplifiers. And I think we're not good enough at drawing from them and then also using them to amplify our messages as well. I think I will leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Madeleine. That's a really great set of very practical and specific ideas there. Yolande, can you tell us a little bit from your perspective how you see sort of collaboration with other actors, particularly with civil society and local communities, in trying to get the message across and also understanding what their views are and building that into what peacekeeping does?
I think this should be a deliberate effort that starts even before deployment, built into the work that starts in advancing and preparing for the particular situations that the peacekeepers are going into, including language and cultural and other factors that affect the success of the mission. And I hope Fran and other colleagues will find a way to clear the bureaucratic hurdles so that, you know, the stratcoms can be fit for purpose and we can move along better on this. There's also, there should be an aspect of active dialogue. It's not just about missions informing the communities, they should be informed by the communities. So it's a two-way dialogue, and that also helps to build trust and avoid speculation and unrealistic expectations. Even with explaining why the mission is there, for instance, shouldn't be taken for granted that people in the host community understand why the mission is there. This has to be clear right from the beginning. So this open communication channels have to be used to address concerns, tackle misinformation together more effectively, and ensure accountability where grievances come up. And there should be an effort to really encourage local input into addressing areas of concern, especially around sensitive issues. There's also the issue of cultural sensitivity and understanding the history and background of that particular community, because wherever the root causes of that particular conflict are not understood, and we've seen that in this area, it just prolongs the conflict, and we seem to be applying solutions that don't work because we don't understand where we're coming from with the particular situations. We also need to address particular needs of women and other vulnerable groups in a very specific way. Also understanding the cultural sensitivities of the area. I think finally, not finally, almost finally, peacekeepers cannot be seen as party to the conflict. There has to be transparency in the mission activities and decision-making processes, so that in order, again, to build that trust and to keep that conversation going with the community. There's one more thing that I think is not talked about enough, and we need to examine, and that's the role of mainstream media, including regional and international media, in perpetuating misinformation. And there's a wider context to this, especially in reporting on Africa and other less developed regions. I mean, across the world, media budgets, and even in big media outlets, budgets are falling, which means there's a reduction in staff, which means the foreign bureaus are not the same as they used to be. They're not staffed the way they used to be. There's increased reliance on inexperienced stringers. We have, for instance, you may have one foreign correspondent reporting for a major Western paper based in one capital, but covering 15 countries. And all the news goes through that one person. And in some areas where there's no media present at all, there's an increased reliance on NGOs. So that affects the quality of reporting that's coming out. If you add to this the general lack of scrutiny on the stories coming from Africa, and a lower standard of rigor when it comes to journalistic ethics, then we'd have mainstream media, whether it's deliberate or not, but then that perpetuates misinformation. And this is something that we see quite often. It's something that needs to be challenged by host governments, by missions, by civil society, by those who have the real facts on the ground. Because if it's not addressed, if it's not challenged, if it's not corrected, then we get into a never-ending cycle of the wrong information being perpetuated by these mega platforms, and it's hard to bring it back. So that's a challenge that needs to be addressed, because it has a huge effect on how peacekeeping operations are perceived. I'll give an example again about Rwanda, for instance. We've had several times, I have personally called editors in Paris, for instance, and major news agencies where there's a story, for instance, on sexual exploitation of minors by a particular troops from a particular country. And the story that appears on that media is a photo of Rwandan troops with a flag of Rwanda, and it's quite blatant. It even mismatches doesn't fit with the title with the heading of the story. So when you call the editors, like, I think there's a misunderstanding here. This story is about this issue, and the photo that's illustrating is completely different. So we've had them apologize and then do the right thing. But if you don't point it out, it just stays there, and it goes into the database of misinformation, and then AI comes in and picks it up, and then it's hard to correct later. So we need to be aware of this and find ways to work with mainstream media, understanding the limitations that international media faces these days, and then work within that to ensure that the right thing is being done.
Thanks so much, Yolanda. Really important point on journalistic ethics and practices. And maybe, Alan, you can tell us a little bit what you see as some of the best practice. Maybe you'll touch on also on this issue in tackling misinformation and hate speech through strategic communications as well. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think it's evident that one of the key things about mis and disinformation is that it thrives where there's a vacuum of information. And, unfortunately, as Franz said, the bureaucracy makes it harder because I think, when something happens and many of the citizens don't get any information about it, that's when bad actors or people who have malicious intentions then step in to provide information, which at the end of the day tends to be, false information and targeted information. So I think that's one of the key things that we need to also consider when it comes to strategic communications. The other thing that, I wanted to mention about it is the response strategies that are implemented by different actors, including, the UN, peacekeeping missions, and different other stakeholders, should be informed by detection measures. Because I think a lot of the responses are usually done, out of the fly, just saying X and X happened, instead of actually looking at what are the root causes of what resulted into this particular case. And an example of this is, for example, when something happens on the ground affecting maybe, military personnel, and then at the end of the day, you don't understand what are the root causes that actually resulted in that misinformation, then it becomes a very hard challenge to actually counter that. And maybe just to emphasize on what Madeleine says in terms of response strategies that are considered, best practice at the moment is a lot of the digital platforms have young audiences, right? And these young audiences, it's very hard to speak their language sometimes. And, a lot of the time when something happens, the main thing that is done is to do press releases or reports, which doesn't go far, right, in addressing the issues, because mis and disinformation itself that is being propagated in these online spaces, and I'll give an example of, the targeting of UN peacekeeping missions in places like Mali, you'd see that a lot of this content is actually really, really interesting content because it's animated, it's satirical, it's comic, and it actually enables the youth to share it even more. Now, the thing about the response is that then it becomes a problem because if we do a lot of the reports and press releases, then it doesn't actually match up with what the online environment is presenting. So that's one of the key things that I think is should be considered, especially going forward in terms of best practices in doing response strategies for mis and disinformation and other online harms. The other thing that I think is particularly important is development of digital resources. And I'll use an example of hate speech, right? In most of our consultations locally in different African countries, we actually realized that, things that are considered to be hate speech in one community or in one jurisdiction are not hate speech in another jurisdiction. And the problem is that big social media platforms or digital platforms don't know those nuances and local contexts. So it becomes a very huge problem in actually countering these particular cases of hate speech or different other digital threats and online harms. And I think it's particularly important. At Code for Africa, one of the things we've started developing is, for example, lexicons, and these are basically terms and language that are primarily used in hate speech context. And these resources are then actually developed by local entities at the grassroots levels of each jurisdiction, because they do understand the main challenges and how people present hate speech in those local jurisdictions. And this then is actually fed into the digital platforms in order for more prompt action to be taken whenever these terminologies are used online. And that, I think, is one approach, is creating these data resources that can then inform a lot of the strategic impact that can be done by the digital platforms. And then finally, I think collaboration is key. I'll actually use a context from Kenya. UNESCO actually had an initiative to create something called a Coalition for Freedom of Expression and Content Moderation. And essentially that coalition had key stakeholders from government, civil society, the UN itself, different other key stakeholders within the environment. And the reason for that is that whenever different stakeholders meet in a room, it becomes very, very effective, because you then share ideas of the limitations that each stakeholder have. And that has been a very, very, I think, a very blindsided thing that we've been seeing happening, because government actors will do their own things, these other actors will do their own things, civil society will be there bashing all these other actors, saying you should do this, but they don't understand what are the challenges across the different other stakeholders. So I think collaborative approaches by formation of these consortia and multi-stakeholder approaches to this is also very, very crucial.
Thank you so much, Alan. And I wanted to thank all of our panelists actually for a really rich and really excellent set of points. And we have about half an hour left, so I want to open up the floor. I'm sure there are lots of questions and comments. So if you would like to take the floor, ask a question, please raise your hand. And I hope there's some, I see somebody over there. I think the microphone is making its way over to you. I think it's a delegate of India, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Sorry, while we're waiting for the microphone, I just wanted to jump in on one of Alan's points about reaching people in a way that they want to be reached and engaged with. One interesting thing I was just told by one of my young team members the other day, because I'm a dinosaur already, is that 2 years ago, people were watching videos around 1 minute 15. Now they're watching 15 seconds. So that is the kind of challenge that we're dealing with trying to get the principles of peacekeeping, or, the story of peacekeeping to people in that kind of limited, framework.
Thanks, that's an excellent point. And I don't know whether this microphone has made its way over yet. If somebody could, there it is.
I speak on behalf of India when I say this, and there are just 2 points I want to add to the discourse on strategic communication. Firstly, I want to draw attention to the linkage between expectations of local communities and the mandates that are set up for peacekeeping missions, which then affects strategic communication. Now, we feel that there are misplaced expectations among local communities about the peacekeepers and about the mandates to protect civilians. Such misunderstandings are further aggravated when we use ambiguous terminologies like robust mandate or robust posturing or even offensive posture in the peacekeeping mandate resolutions of the Security Council, which then creates room for speculative and arbitrary interpretation of these. So for effective strategic communication of peace operations, we feel it is important that the Security Council drafts mandates which are comprehensible, which are implementable, and mandates that lucidly delineate intent, which minimize ambiguity and correlate tasks and resources. It is also equally important that local communities are made aware of these mandates, including what peacekeepers can do for them and also what they cannot do, while also explaining the responsibilities which primarily lie with the host state. A very quick second point I'd like to add is that we feel that strategic communication should be uniform and harmonious across all means of communication in order to avoid conflicting messaging. This harmonious and coherent mission communication strategy can help peace operations to not only convey the messages clearly, but also receive feedback from the population, which can, in effect, then further improvise the mandate implementation. Thank you. That's all from my side.
authority that that clarity might widen the gap between expectation and the mandate. On this issue, strategic communication is well understood, the importance, and it is also nicely pointed out that this is not a panacea for the challenges that peacekeeping missions faces. I would like to highlight two things. The first thing is whether we should be focusing on only disinformation and misinformation. The reason why I'm saying to be a credible messenger, for example, I just hypothesis, in a conflict situation there are parties. So one party is spreading misinformation and disinformation. This is not enough. They are also spreading information. So when we focus on strategic communication, whether we will only deconstruct the misinformation and disinformation, or at the same time, whether we will highlight the information that parties in conflict are spreading to become a credible messenger. The second point is, though it's a digital phenomena, in the age of AI, one panelist has rightly pointed out, the AI-generated content will be a challenge in the coming days. And given that, we need to be analog. There are many actors, stakeholders. So my point is whether where we should be going to mainstream media, going to civil society, NGOs, but there is less discussions or no discussions on the importance of spreading the correct information through traditional leaders, religious leaders. So this is a point of attention whether we would be doing. The third point is the social listening devices that we are also talking about in peacekeeping missions. I would like to know the panelists' views on this, the social listening devices, as well as vis-a-vis the privacy, the data protection. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Lieutenant Colonel Deo Mutabazi, Milad of Rwanda to UN. My question, I'm reacting to Alan's statement and some others who talked about just the not having a common definition of hate speech, of not even detecting or considering the hate speech as hate speech. But we have seen some countries have enacted the laws against hate speech, while others exactly have kind of legitimized it. And those who do legitimize it, do it in the, again, in the protection of freedom of expression, and hence not even striking a balance between freedom of speech and protecting the freedom of speech and safeguarding the vulnerable community's right, which is also a basic right, the right to live. And in the context of POC, why do we observe this with silence? Thank you very much. I wish to hear from Francesca and Alan. Again, I'm reacting again to Yolanda's statement when she said that we should not politicize misinformation, disinformation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dale. So I now turn back to the panel.
Yeah, just to one of the points about the importance of disciplined communication, I agree with you, it should be across mission, but also between mission and headquarters, and that is one of our biggest challenges, is aligning what we are saying at the local level and also the global level. On the issue of faith-based and community leaders, they are really critical to our communication, and it goes both ways. In some ways, they are, responsible for spreading information that is not accurate about what we're doing, and that can be for various purposes. But on the other hand, they're also a very powerful voice for us and a proxy communicator. They sometimes have more credibility than we do when it's communicating about the challenges and what the role of peacekeeping is. So I can't emphasise enough the importance of using proxy communicators, but this also raises protection risks. Sometimes us using people as proxy communicators exposes them to physical harm. We've seen that in places like the DRC when there was a wave of anti-UN sentiment and there were violent demonstrations against peacekeepers, but it also resulted in civilians being killed as well. So we have to be very careful on that front. In terms of host governments and particular actors and the narratives that are out there, we do have to be very careful. We have to protect our relationship with host governments because we can't operate without their consent. We also want to hold people accountable who are spreading mis and disinformation, and there are various ways of doing that. It doesn't always have to be the mission, and sometimes there are good reasons why you don't. For example, we've had 2 spokespeople declared persona non grata in the last couple of years from very sensitive missions. So they lost their jobs for speaking the truth, and so we have to protect our personnel. Sometimes we use headquarters to make those kind of connections instead, or we use other entities who are actually tasked with identifying these kind of actors as part of their roles. So it's not an easy position to be in, but we do our best in the way that we can.
Thanks a lot, Fran. And so I'd like to give the chance to those who would like to take the floor to respond. Maybe Madeleine, and then we'll go down as we did.
Sure, I'll try and be quick as well. So just responding to my colleague from India's point about, clear mandates that avoid ambiguity, I think we have to probably be honest with ourselves that a document drafted by the UN Security Council is never going to be awesome content for the youth in Malakal or Goma, right? It's just, we need to find ways to ensure that those mandates resonate with local communities. I'm not a comms expert, but there are good examples out there of peacekeeping missions making the mandates real for the people they're protecting. Just picking up on Aditi's point about, misinformation by host governments, look, I think we have to be honest that this can change over time as well. So in my time in Mali, we went from a relatively positive relationship between the mission and host government to a pretty bad one through the elections and the coup, the first coup. And I would sort of support what Fran said about using amplifiers and proxy communicators where you can. So, a deliberate misinformation about a UN mission, the UN mission doesn't need to be the one that goes back and starts a fight on that. They can use others who perhaps are more trusted. I think we also need to think about that host governments are not homogenous. So there may be particular individuals in host governments who are particularly negative about the UN mission, but there will be others, whether that's at local government level or whatever, who might be more minded to a different message. And I'd also say that I think in those situations, just from, again, my personal experience, we should focus in clarifying facts, not narratives. So, there are wrong facts put out. When I was in Mali, there was a lot of, during the coup, there was this accusation that the mission was harboring the president, protecting him from the coup. It was false. So, we encourage the mission to say that, to say, no, we are not sheltering the president. He's not on our base. But stay away from the sort of narrative piece of that. Like, what does that mean? What is our value judgment on what is going on in the political context? So, really focus on facts. And, I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Yolanda, over to you.
Just addressing the question about host governments being the spread of misinformation. I think one thing that can, guard against this, situations are different. It's a case-by-case basis, but in general, I think there needs to be consistency in putting people first. Putting people first, the people who need protection and the reason that we are there in the first place, then communicating successes clearly. I think the contradictions that pop up, that lingering, have to be addressed honestly, and then continued direct dialogue with the government and other stakeholders. I think these are efforts that need to continue in general in in situations like this. I mean, if we give an example of, for instance, I know MONUSCO's taken a beating lately, but there's some successes that need to be talked about more. I saw yesterday that they tweeted about that in the last 20 years or so, over 10,000 ex-combatants have been repatriated to Rwanda, where we have a very successful DDR program. That's a very positive thing, not well known, and it's something that MONUSCO has managed to do, working with other stakeholders here in the DRC over the years. And along with, if there were other actions, positive actions along that, in that direction, then we could go some way into starting to resolve the root causes of the conflict in Eastern DRC. So successes have to be communicated, but it's essentially about putting people first. And the reason why these combatants actually come to the MONUSCO base is because they trust that they will then be protected and then sent back into a program that will, lead to them eventually being reintegrated back into their community. That's a good thing. So these have to be communicated quite clearly, so that the respect for these missions grow and the trust becomes more entrenched.
May I just quickly add on that, because I remembered what I was going to say, built on your point. We're not good enough at communicating successes, which then creates a conducive environment for a crisis, that the atmosphere is already a little bit better when we start. I was discussing last night at dinner with our Force Commander friend from UNMISS about the data he has been generating with his team about successful protection situations, and having that data to then communicate to the Security Council, to the host government, and to the communities is real. So this draws back to the point that strategic comms is not something a comms team does in the center of the mission. It's something everybody needs to be engaged in collecting those best practice stories and communicating them in a coherent, consistent, and regular way to everyone.
I wanted to also, sorry Alan, because I want to give you the floor, but I also wanted to say that I'm really glad, Yolande, that you pointed out that example from Congo, because the mission is actually now starting in light of the transition periods and also the upcoming elections, and we expect a much an increase in mis and disinformation directed against MONUSCO. They've started actually a campaign of putting out a little bit the record of MONUSCO over its 20 years and some of the good things that the mission has contributed to in the country. And that's also something that we're definitely encouraging other missions to do, to pick out and to spotlight particular successes in the history and trajectory of missions, and put those out in short snippets as well. So thanks for pointing that out, and glad that you picked up on it. So Alan, over to you now.
Thank you so much. So I'll quickly just share some responses on a number of questions. And the first one was around only focusing on mis and disinformation. And, actually mis and disinformation is part of a larger problem called the information disorder, right? And there are several other digital threats and digital conflict dynamics that many of us need to also focus on. And here you can talk about, online trolling, information operations or influence operations. We have cases of extremist messaging. All these are things that we need to focus on aside from mis and disinformation, because all these other things are not necessarily false and can't be categorized as mis or disinformation, but are important enough for us to also have a focus on them. And then in terms of the risks around AI that was raised by the colleague from Bangladesh, I think the main thing about it is AI is presenting risks that we can see in the digital ecosystem, but also it's presenting an opportunity for us to use it as a force for good. And that is one of the things we've been trying to advocate. For example, at the moment in Kenya, we are building something called a data lake, or a central repository of conflict and violence information in order to proactively identify cases of conflict and violence, possible cases of conflict and violence for preventive mechanisms. And it's kind of dubbed digital peace building, and it's using machine learning and AI to actually do that. So it's high time for us to also try and figure out, how can we leverage on these technologies as a force for good at the end of the day, even if there are so many risks that are accompanied by this. And also this is also related to issues around social listening and privacy and data protection that was raised. One of the things that I can say about that is social listening leverages on open data. So it doesn't go into private information. So there isn't a risk of infringing on data protection rules and privacy rights of different actors. So a lot of the work that we do is based on publicly available information, which then informs some of the narratives that are trending, because mis- and disinformation actors or malicious actors don't necessarily want to target private spaces a lot of the time. They want to amplify their voices, and they do that through public communication. And that is also the way we actually are able to do social listening through various techniques, social media monitoring, and several other tools and techniques in order to do this. And then finally, in terms of the question about hate speech and legitimization of hate speech, and vis-a-vis freedom of expression, the one thing I always say is my rights digitally actually start where yours end. So at the end of the day, if there is freedom of expression, my freedom of expression should not be infringing on another person's freedom of expression. So legitimizing just hate speech, saying that if we actually try to detect and counter hate speech, it will be infringing on freedom of expression, it's actually, probably not the correct move, right? Because you then need to look at, the person who's has the intention to spread these malicious actions and content online, they are actually infringing on the freedom of expression of the next person. So there needs to be legal structures that are put in place in order to address that. Thank you so much.
Naomi, if I may, yes, sorry. I think just jumping in on the hate speech and your rights ending where someone else's begin. But what happens? What next? How do we then address it in a consistent way? Because this is something that I said at the beginning, when someone within the UN system who's appointed to do that kind of work, to monitor monitor hate speech and help us all prevent genocide, sounds the alarm, and this is not taken up, and then you have another part of the system that puts out reports that then blame the victims. There's a contradiction there that needs to be addressed. And even a more, sorry about this, about MONUSCO also, in terms of consistency, we saw I don't know if we saw what happened this weekend, right here at the border, 200 kilometers away from where we're sitting right now. We had the same people same groups, illegal armed groups, including the FDLR, who are responsible for hate speech in Eastern DRC, were at the border on the DRC side, armed, with children mingling in the crowd, shouting hate speech with their guns. I didn't see any communication about that. I don't know if there was any kind of social listening about that, but that's an example of something that's left unsaid by the right people that then contributes to the perpetuation of hate speech and emboldens the people who continue to do this. And then it has a direct effect on people's lives, including on exodus of refugees seeking safety across the border, that then go into another UN system for protection, and another host and another government. So I think all these are tied together, and this is the point about consistency. So yes, we need to communicate successes, but we also need to point out the challenges and where, when threats emerge that are very clear to the naked eye, hundreds of people with guns at a border shouting across words that we all know very well historically, that we all recognize, that the UN has been teaching us about for the last almost 30 years. I think this is something that needs to be addressed, and it cannot go without being said, because we're living it right now.
Thanks, Yolande, for pointing that out, and indeed that's something to look into, and I think that's also why we're trying to take a whole of mission approach when we think about mis and disinformation, and think about a differentiated response too between these different phenomena, because obviously when we talk about hate speech, there are certain legal parameters that kick in, particularly when hate speech amounts to discrimination, hostility, or violence, incitement to those things. And there are also measures, I think, across a peacekeeping mission, other components can do. It's not only about STRATCOMs, it's also about the human rights components, about the force, the police, the political components as well, being aware of what's happening and taking action. I think we're a few minutes away from the end of the session, but I'll give a chance for another round of questions. I see 3 hands here and 1 hand over there. So if we could find microphones, please, to the people. We have a cluster of 3 here and 1 hand over there. And meanwhile, maybe I'll also just build on what Alan said with regard to the social listening. I think there was a question about the social listening tools, and just to say, and Frank can complement, but in our missions we use a number of different commercially available tools, some which look at more sort of, that are basically designed for marketing or advertising purposes, and trying to look at what is out there on digital platforms, and other tools which are more specific to analysis of disinformation using AI as well. I would say that there's no one tool that is a silver bullet, and technology can only take you so far. One needs to have also human capacity and the human finesse to really understand the context and some of the issues Alan was talking about around sort of the meaning of language and understanding the nuances of what is being said online really requires, for now, human capacity as well. So technology alone won't do it. But I'll take the chance to say also that in DPO, we are trying to now, in the spirit of digital transformation and trying to get into the digital world and stop being so analog, we're trying to develop a bespoke tool for monitoring and analysis that we hope to collaborate with actors like Code for Africa and other research organizations on, to try to be able to have a tool that is addressing the peacekeeping needs and pulling in data from different sources. So do we have a microphone to the people who would like to? There we go.
Disinformation and misinformation. What else apart from causing that psychological component that is meant to bring a tide in the thinking processes of the communities that leads them to be mobilized as a result of misinformation? Thank you.
Congratulations to all of you with the UN Day, which we are celebrating today. I have a small question. First of all, the comment. It is clear that I'm from the Russian Federation, Minister of Foreign Affairs, excuse me for not introducing myself, Sergei Dergachev. It is clear for everyone that misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech is evil that we should address. But how do peacekeeping missions distinguish misinformation, disinformation from rightful criticism towards the peacekeeping missions? My concern is that we can imagine the situation when this fight against disinformation can finally lead us to some kind of censorship against those who voice concerns about the effectiveness of the peacekeeping missions. And I think it's very critical, as my colleague from India told, to hear those voices in order for the mission to become more effective. And also I wanted to tackle the question about the global media outlets spreading disinformation. What can peacekeeping missions do with this? And also I cannot stress enough that the need for joint communications with the host government is really critical, and we, as the Russian Federation, as a permanent member of the Security Council, believe that the good relations between the host government are instrumental for the mission's success, and we always promote fruitful cooperation between them, either publicly or privately. And I think the question that my American colleague raised about the claims of host government spreading disinformation should be presented by the missions to the Security Council and very carefully considered and addressed by it. Thank you very much.
So this preparatory conference, it would have been also better if it was started from the ground and then we come here, so that we know the problems, what is affecting the community, what type of protection they need actually. And therefore I recommend to the UN, like, they need to recruit locals who speak the language, understand the culture in the ground, so that maybe the translators has issues, because if you have one translator for the whole maybe battalions, how do you expect that person to communicate effectively the information that intended to? And also my question is, how is the government or the host government would reject UN if the UN is coming with development activities? So if any government, I'm sure here there are government delegates, when there is a development activities being brought into your country, you will support that mission and there will not be misunderstanding. But most of the host governments, they are seeing UN as police for them, like they are not working collaboratively, but instead they are competing, and then they are seeing the UN is looking at them as if they are doing bad things. So there is a need for good communication between the government, the civil society, and the local community and the UN. Thank you.
Maybe I'll jump in on two of the questions from the audience. And the first one is about mis and disinformation being weaponized. And it's human nature to actually want to believe certain types of contents. So I think, yeah, there is some psychological elements to it, and it affects also the strategic communication part of it and the response part of it. So I think, mis and disinformation has actually been weaponized a lot, and I do agree with what you said. It's just about now, trying to find those scientific, and even social media companies that are being used to actually do this a lot. They've done studies on how humans interact. The aspect you mentioned about the 15 seconds, it's actually based on a study for them to be able to do that. So it's a matter of us also trying to figure out what are the ways that we can use to respond in effect. And then in terms of the roots and causes of mis and disinfo that you raised, maybe I'll just do a quick comment, but I know, some of the other panelists will comment on that. Yeah, the disinformation is actually a very profitable environment. It's an economy in itself. That's one thing we've been able to establish. There are so many people who are earning, huge amounts of money through AdSense, for example, Google AdSense, by sponsoring ads, but then contain controversial types of content. And that is one of the ways that incentivizes bad actors to actually engage in this. There are several other issues, and mis and disinformation and different other online and digital threats, they actually leverage on societal issues. In Kenya, for example, land is a very big issue, and it's actually being used as a precursor for sharing a lot of mis and disinformation. Similarly to what we see in the Sahel, in different other countries within the region. Unemployment is becoming a very, very interesting thing, because a lot of the young audiences on these platforms, they are incentivized easily by actually just finding a job, and that job can be basically sitting somewhere to spread mis and disinformation, to create content that then is shared online. So I think also trying to figure out these root causes to it is actually a strategic move in order to address the challenges. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Yolanda, over to you.
Just very quickly on two issues. So how to differentiate legitimate criticism from misinformation. I think criticism has to be addressed. I think my fellow panelists here already said it has to be addressed head-on and honestly, not defensively, where possible, and when when missions are communicating successes as well, then you have a leg to stand on to talk about other things, even where you've made mistakes, and address that and then move on. So it has to be just addressed head on. In terms of mainstream media and misinformation, what missions can do, I think the first thing is to be aware of it. Let's not assume because it's big international mainstream media, it's a trust, that these are trustworthy sources. It depends on who you are and where you're coming from. I think this needs to be addressed by the affected party. Understood. We need to understand it when we see it, and then addressed factually and without fear. And it has to be consistent, so that those who are propagating this, whether it's deliberate or not, are then aware that they have to actually adhere to their own standards. So they have to be reminded that this has to be done.
Thanks. I'll just pick up 2 points. One is the same issue of misinformation, disinformation, and criticism. I think both are important. Missions are not perfect. Humans are not perfect. They make mistakes. You address them and you move on, in the words of my colleague. And then just one final thought, I think, just to leave as my sort of final reflection from the panel. Strategic comms is about setting a strategic direction for a group of people. And I think the big challenge for the peacekeeping community going forward over the next 2 years is strategic communications about missions closing and leaving and drawing down. And we've got to get that messaging right and focus and get the balance of messaging about successes and what still needs to be done right. And a challenge to all of those of you working in missions now is, how do you set that context of your communications now to create a smooth glide path to a UN departure in the future, whenever that might be. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Madeleine.
Yeah, just feeding off that point, I agree with panellists that mis and disinformation, it is a huge and growing issue, but we shouldn't let it become an obsession. It's like going down a rabbit hole, and I think that we do need to make sure that we are still thinking strategically about those challenges ahead, because all the time that we spend today on dealing with disinformation is time that we don't have to look to the horizon about the challenges that are coming and being better prepared. I also agree about not letting the pendulum swing too far, that it is vital that we are held accountable. Freedom of expression should be protected. That is what the UN is all about. So we have to be very careful that we understand very clearly and distinguish between legitimate criticism and accountability and mis and disinformation. And that's something I think we're working on in missions to improve that understanding. Lastly, to my friend from South Sudan, just to say I couldn't agree with you more that our communication should be community-led. In South Sudan, 75% of our communication staff are national staff, and they speak many languages, not the 64 languages that exist in South Sudan, but I think I just can't emphasise enough the fact that we have local voices talking to local people about the challenges and also the benefits of peacekeeping. So again, and I'm using my South Sudan context too, I think we work very hard on that, including involving the host authorities, civil society, and the mission and peacekeepers in joint communication, and particularly in outreach event and radio events, which we've talked about. I think we sometimes lose sight of that social media is not everything, and so it's important to remember those roles as well in terms of communicating to the local population. And thank you for your help in South Sudan and Bentiu. It's appreciated.
Well, I just wanted to maybe say a couple of comments building also on what the panelists said and before closing. One is that I absolutely agree with everything that has been said around how to deal with legitimate criticism versus disinformation, and I think the focus is very much on being humble and engaging with legitimate criticism. But I would also like to point out, because I'm also steeped in the kind of disinformation space, that we see also a lot of legitimate criticism that is amplified using inauthentic means online. And so I think one has to ask a question, to what extent then is legitimate grievance also being instrumentalized and amplified in ways that may be artificial. And that's something that we're looking at very closely and trying to get better at identifying. And linked to that is, we've talked about mainstream media here, but we haven't really talked about the enormous, vast amount of new web-based, social media-based, so-called media outlets that exist on, whether it's on Facebook or on Twitter and other social media platforms. And a lot of when we talk about disinformation, malinformation, hate speech, a lot of that is being propagated through those means as well. So there's also a need for us to focus on sort of the new, non-traditional, alternative media, let's say, that is online. But with that, I would like to really thank this brilliant panel, really rich discussions, lots of really excellent points, and I'm obviously not going to summarize any of it, but thank you so much. It was really great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naomi, for the excellent style of moderation, quite unique, and we were very impressed. And that is why I gave you 10 more minutes. And also one of the panelists gave a very good comment about our timekeeping. Therefore, I was bribed. So I gave them extra time because of that too. So without further ado, we are going to have a tea break for about 30 minutes. So time now, who has a watch here? It's 10:40, I added 10 minutes. So we're going to have tea for another 30 minutes, and then we'll be back at 11:10. Enjoy your tea, and let's meet for the next session at 11:10. Thank you.